George Haas here. I wanted to continue this conversation around meditation interventions for the addiction process, module 4, difficult interpersonal relationships as causal to relapse. I think that talking about this from an attachment point of view is useful. The main difficulty for people who use addictive strategies to regulate their emotion, I think it's fair to consider addiction as a system of emotional regulation, either substances or processes, that somewhere along the line, the actual experience that people had of their caregivers was that they were so unreliable that it was better not to have to depend on them. So the main way as herd animals, or the gold standard, say, of emotional regulation when you can't do it for yourself, is to turn to someone else to help you. So if you look at the caregiver-child dynamic, children don't really have much facility or resilience in terms of regulating their emotion, and they turn to their caregivers not only for instruction on what their emotions are, but in how to regulate them. If the experience with the original caregiver was unreliable, so much so that the child couldn't count on turning to someone to relieve their emotional distress, then since emotional regulation is a requirement, not something that you can opt out of, people who use addiction made a decision along the way to develop strategies for emotional regulation that don't cause them to rely on other people. Difficult personal relationships are often emotionally volatile, so that you have these situations where there's a lot of emotional regulation to do. If you're convinced that other people aren't reliable to turn to in moments of distress, then the cause of the distress in the relationship is then met with a lack of willingness to turn to people to help you manage and regulate these difficult situations. Attachment, which forms very early, tends to fall into these distinct patterns. I've described the skill set of secure attachment, and today I'd like to describe the skill set of a dismissing attachment strategy. Reflecting on the childhood of people who develop a dismissing attachment strategy, when the child turned over and over again to their caregiver for their attachment needs to be met, for reunion and co-regulation with their caregiver, they were so consistently rejected in childhood that they gave up asking. This is a terrible sadness that arises from that. And in order for a child to endure such terrible sadness, such a terrible sense of betrayal, emotional repression became the means of regulating emotion. So what you notice in dismissing people is that they have a lack of emotional affect. They have a lack of empathy. If you suppress awareness of your own emotional experience, you also suppress awareness of the empathetic experience of others. The dismissing skill set is the most rigid. You have an idealizing mind state, that is a way of looking at the world and looking at yourself in these very idealized ways. You have a lack of memory of early childhood as the second skill set. The lack of memory of early childhood prevents the dismissing strategists from organizing a coherent narrative of their life. So there's often a strong disconnect between the way they perceive the past, or the way that they've formulated the idea of the past, and what actually happened. They use a derogating anger, or put down anger, a devaluing anger, as a way of regulating their experience of abandonment. If they have the perception of being abandoned, then they devalue the object, the attachment figure, to the point that the loss wouldn't matter because they're of so little value. And they have a hypersensitivity to the perception of rejection. So these 4 skills, a capacity for an idealizing view is 1. The second is a lack of memory of early childhood, which precludes forming a coherent narrative of their life. 3 is the derogating anger. And 4 is hypersensitivity to the perception of rejection. So you may notice dismissing strategists as seductive or bullying. And that's how I tend to characterize it. They seduce you into agreeing with their worldview. If they're skillful at it, often they can tell you the thing that you've always wanted to hear. You feel them to be loving and charismatic. And then as soon as you really become attached to that quality of seduction that they provide, they tend to withdraw so that you'll pursue them. In being pursued, they have a sense of reassurance that you won't abandon them. If you ask them questions about their early life, often the remembrances of what happened to them begin in adolescence, so around age 12. But before age 12, very few specific memories of things that happened, a more general memory of how things were or what may have happened or what the house was like, but not a specific memory of something that happened. The lack of memory is not a dissociation. It is an intentional focus away from things that are difficult to deal with. In the human experience, memory is formed always in relationship to the intensity of the emotional experience. So in people who use a dismissing strategy, they have a deliberate focus away from things that are distressing or intense emotionally toward things that are neutral. So turning away from a troubling experience with a caregiver to the pattern of the carpet or the wall, over and over again, directing and focusing attention away from the difficult experience on things that are neutral. Without the intense emotional experience or the intense emotional component of the experience, the body-mind does not make a strong memory, and the intentional focus on neutral things causes there to be a general sense of what happened without any specific memory. The derogating or put-down anger is an anger that devalues the attachment figures so that they become something that whether you lose them or not doesn't matter. This is a distorting view. Often what happens to somebody who uses a dismissing strategy is that the derogating view enters and they devalue the person and they act from the place of anger. One way to put it is they get really mad and then they break the thing. And then when the dismissing view leaves, they see the value that they really hold for the person, and then begin to discount the harm that was caused by the anger in the relationship. You often find yourself in a cycle of talking about things that happened and that didn't happen. And then if that did happen, it wasn't a big deal. And if it wasn't a big deal, it wasn't my fault, or I didn't mean it. And if I did mean it, it's your fault because you drove me to do it. The lack of coherent narrative, the sensitivity to rejection that comes as the last skill is really in line with their worldview. If you look at the experience of somebody who suppresses their own emotion, they don't really have a ready access to the thing that drives them. It doesn't mean it's not informing their decisions. It just means that they're not consciously aware of it. So they may be angry but not have awareness of their anger, and the gesture that they take in the world may be representative of somebody who would be angry, but they don't see the anger in it and are often surprised by the reaction that people get. The sensitivity to rejection is around a worldview that is informed by a lack of empathy. If we talk about empathy in humans, the first level of empathy is the spontaneous reaction to the perception of someone else's physical pain. The second level of empathy is where you can look at somebody and read their facial expressions and their body language to understand what their internal experience must be like. And the third is to empathetically connect to somebody else so that you feel in your body a facsimile of the other person's internal experience. So you're actually feeling into them, you have a sense of them. We use as human beings the second level of empathy where we read the person's outer expression and then compare it to the third level of empathy. And if they match, we tend to believe that they're being authentic or that they're telling us the truth. This is a system that can be easily manipulated, so that you should always be paying attention to what they do and compare it to the other two. But in somebody who's using a dismissing strategy, because they repress awareness of their own emotion and they repress awareness of the empathetic experience, really they rely on the second level of empathy. If you use only an awareness of somebody's exterior presentation to understand what their internal experience must be like, you need to be good at reading facial expressions and body language. Often what you'll meet in a person who uses a dismissing strategy is someone who's not skilled in the second level of empathy and has no awareness of the third level of empathy. So what they're wanting from you is an explicit expression of how they're feeling in words so that they have some way to gauge. If you don't do that for them, they're essentially blind to the experience of the other person, the experience of you. And so they make up in their own system a representation of you and become very defensive about it. If they present to you how they think you are responding to something and you contradict them, then you're causing in them almost terror-like state that points to their blindness in the situation. And so they'll begin a process of attempting to seduce you into their worldview or bullying you into their worldview, which is an attempt to reassure them that they're experiencing the world the way that it is, and that the disconnect emotionally, the disconnect empathetically is not causing them to put themselves in danger. In the adult world, of dismissing people don't form long-lasting relationships as often as other attachment strategies. So there tends to be more of them available in, say, the dating pool. One study that I am aware of said that 7 out of 10 people past their mid-30s that are single are also using a dismissing strategy. So it's important for you to begin to pay attention to this. If you want to have a supportive, mutual relationship, then this is going to be a challenge with a dismissing person. If you are, in fact, dismissing, the repairs are pretty straightforward. You need to begin to undo the suppression and repression of emotional experience. If you can undo the repression of emotional experience and have a moment-by-moment awareness of it, the empathetic experience of other people also returns, because that's no longer being repressed. You do then also have to learn how to regulate emotion consciously, because you've unwound your principal means of emotional regulation. The second thing that dismissing people need to do is to make space for other people's exploration. In the experience of the avoidant child, each time they return to their caregiver and began to explore their exploration with them, they were rebuffed. And so they learned actually to be pretty good explorers, but they never learned the value of sharing the exploration with someone else. Often it never even occurs to them that somebody else would be interested in hearing the experiences of their exploration. So the repair here is then to begin to risk the vulnerability of sharing intimately your experiences of exploration in the world. And then to make space to begin to value other people's sharing of their exploration, so the relationships become mutual. Often what dismissing people demand is that the other person abandon their exploration and simply serve to support them in their exploration. The view of the dismissing strategist is that I'm pretty great. The problem here is not me. The problem here is that you are deficient. So that while I'm excellent at getting my needs met, you are not actually capable of meeting them. It creates in them a moral condition where they feel that it's okay to take whatever they need from somebody without reciprocating. That with an equal, they would feel morally justified in reciprocating, but since most people are not actually up to it, the taking of what they need without reciprocating is fine. So next time we'll begin to talk about preoccupied attachment. We'll talk about fearful avoidant. We'll talk about unresolved attachment. And then we'll talk about how these attachment strategies work dynamically in relationships, and then follow up with how to begin to shift in the direction of more secure relationships. If you can't turn to somebody and reliably co-regulate with them, you're leaving out of your toolkit for emotional regulation the best one we have. And that makes you much more susceptible to turning to substances and behaviors as a way of regulating yourself when you get really distressed and you can't bring yourself back into balance. So finding a way to make relationships work that can also be productive in the co-regulation thing is basically the way out of addiction.